during the Cold War. Number 10. The Cold War. Some of our viewers may have lived through the times classified as the Cold War, but let me clarify for anyone who doesn't know or was too deep into hippie culture to remember what the heck was going on. And honestly, it's pretty messed up. So in a nutshell, after World War II ended, Germany was split into two. One side, capitalist allies, the other, communist Soviet Union. Russia was an ally during World War II, but this relationship quickly deteriorated. The two political and economic ideologies would grow distaste for one another, and would compete politically, economically, and most fearfully, with their militaries. The United States being the superpower on the one side, and the Soviet Union on the other. They spread their views, a lot of times by force, until almost the entire world was divided by the two styles of government, lasting from 1945 all the way up until MTV was still good, around the mid-90s. When the Soviet Union was dissolved. That's a lot of history to unpack here, so I'm gonna do my best to tell you some crazy facts and to make you laugh. I'm a comedian, it's what I do. Number 9. Charlie in the trees. We've talked about Vietnam a few times on this channel, but I can't stress this enough. It was messed up for many people, Americans and Vietnamese alike. As a Canadian, we mostly dodged that hairy situation. While the Vietnam War was America's worst war since World War II, and the most costly in terms of lives and budget, it was not the only conflict. Vietnam was probably the hottest war of the Cold War, but there's many other little things that make this such an interesting time. France had spent years trying to reclaim their colony, and with no luck. America being there for a total legit reason of containment also didn't have much luck, especially after 1968. Refer to our Vietnamese war videos, they're pretty good. Lives lost, lessons learned, and hopefully somebody found Charlie. I swear, in every movie they're always looking for a guy named Charlie. I guess we never find him, I don't know. Number 8. The name's Bond. James Bond. It would be difficult to talk about the Cold War without talking about espionage and spies. While not to the exaggerated level the 007 series likes to take things with its, well, little people and lethal hat throwing, there was still, however, a ton of black ops going on behind the scenes. You only have to look at the superpower spy agencies, the CIA and the KGB. Both agencies went on globe-trotting clandestine operations to gather information, sabotage, and just about anything else James Bond would do. Stealth, spy gadgets, and missions to save the world. All martini shaken, of course, not stirred. Just like Bond, except the whole womanizing thing. Or maybe there was, as the Soviets would often use women's alluring good looks to produce results they so wished for. Ah yes, thanks to beautiful female agent sleeping a lot, thank you, we now know we are one step closer to discovering the Colonel's secret herbs and spices. Our chicken shall have flavor soon. Number 7. Fallout. Probably the heaviest underlying theme of the Cold War was the constant and looming threat of nuclear annihilation. The US got smart in the end of 1945 and developed and used the world's first atomic bombs. This was great for America, not so great for Japan. America was feeling mighty high. That was until the Soviet Union developed their own shortly after. Now it wasn't so cool anymore. Both sides were worried that further escalation of any issue in the Cold War would lead to mutually assured destruction, rendering the bombs the most destructive weapon on Earth and also the most useless. And to be fair, there was a good chance of that happening. There were multiple instances of escalation where the world watched on as the two superpowers were about to end it all. Finna act up because they wanted their politics to be number 1. I'ma act up. Number 6. Space Race. No, the space race is not a race on how many special brownies that you can eat and see how fast it takes you to space out. Remember grade 10, right? I know. What it actually was a race to see who could develop the best and fastest space age technology and advancements. Which, if you study economics, could be a good thing. Healthy competition driven by new technology. In reality, it kinda sucked though. In the 1950s, Russia launched the first satellite, the Sputnik, which to America was scary because it's America. We never lost anything. The Soviet Union would follow up with the first animal in space and then the first man. Some experiments unfortunately never made it back in one piece. America then trumped them back by landing on the moon. Now what's so messed up? Well, for the Soviet Union, this began to put a severe dent in their economy. All the spending on space and military was having an effect on their people. In a nutshell, it made them broke. And if you want to figure out what style of government is better, well, the US has Las Vegas, Russia has beets, and turnips, and depressed artists. Number 5. The Limping Lady. World War II was the cause and effect for a lot of things. If you like spies and espionage, it's kinda where it all started. One of the best spies who did more than her fair share was Virginia Hall, a lady with a peg leg who thwarted German plans again and again, with her sidekick and peg leg nicknamed Cuthbert. She was credited by top German officials as being the most dangerous spy of all time. In one OSS report, her team is credited with destroying 4 bridges, derailing a freight train, and neutralizing 150 enemies, with hundreds more captured. Now, I'm not a world-class detective or anything, but I feel like if you're trying to find the female spy with a peg leg, it isn't that hard, on account of, some pretty specific identifying features. I don't know how you messed that up. Where is the lady? Where is her? And you hear her walking down the hall. She got a peg leg. What do you mean? Number 4, Miss General. Fuhau was one of 60 wives to Emperor Wu Ding, which I'm not sure even Mormons can figure that out. But to avoid obscuring into the background like TV's least favorite sister wife, she took control. According to records, she led many successful military campaigns and commanded an army of 13,000. While stories of the past can get lost, this is most likely true, as her tomb was full of many different weapons like great axes, which was common to bury distinguished generals with at the time. When I'm buried as a warrior princess, I want my collection of pop figures to come with me. I spent too much time on those bad boys to not take them with me to the afterlife. Number 3, Fatality. Tamiris was the queen of Mazagate, or at least I think that's how it's pronounced, a confederation of nomadic tribes that lived east of the Caspian Sea. She ruled during the 6th century BC and is most famous for her vengeful war she waged against the Persian king Cyrus the Great. At first, the war wasn't going too great. Unfortunately, her son claimed his life out of shame for losing in battle. Mom was not happy and promised the bloodiest battle ever. Well, she wasn't lying. As the promised battle was very bloody, many Persians perished in battle, including Cyrus. When his body was recovered, the vengeful queen harnessed the power of mid-90s fighting games and removed his head and turned his skull into a cup and proclaimed, "Drink your fill of blood." Nice. Number 2, the beautiful samurai. What does it mean to be a samurai? Armor, a kick-ass sword, and a code of honor? Yes, it does. And Tomoe Gozen did it all and had time to look good doing it. Tomoe Gozen's life is shrouded in mystery and many debate her existence, but whatever be the case, she did leave a mark on history. A very red-stained mark on history. Earning the respect of the men around her, it was stated that she had long black hair and a fair complexion and was in command of a large number of men. However, her biggest claim to fame, when she was approached by multiple foes, she rode right at them, grabbing their leader and liberating his head from his shoulders. Wow, you slay it, queen. Number 1, who else could it go to but the Maid of Orleans? All the badass women who went through a lot on this list, they seen some stuff, honey. But Joan of Arc, girl, she takes the cake. Joan was born a poor peasant but had a unique gift. She could speak to the gods, and the gods told her it was her time to shine. By the time she was 19, she had led thousands of men to battle and in glorious victory. Charles VII, losing the 100 Years' War at the time, said, "Alright, sure, send the girl to fight. What have we got to lose?" Well, they actually had a lot to win. Once Joan had gotten involved, the French began to win victory after victory, and her claims of being guided by God didn't seem so far-fetched after all. The British, being so shaken up by the young girl's military prowess, thought she had been possessed by the devil. The British, not liking losing war to a teenage girl, decided to treat her with compassion by keeping her warm with a fire while she was tied to a wooden post. Joan would later become a legend for her efforts, because getting burned at the stake is honestly a lot and I can't even deal.
Kicking off the list at number 10, Goose Green Battle. Although the British were taking on large numbers of Argentinian soldiers, their unit, outnumbered, still came out on top. The Battle of Goose Green took place on May 28th and May 29th, 1982. It ended with over 900 Argentine soldiers surrendering. It was a rocky start to the operation, to say the least. Argentinian forces were ready when the British arrived. The main assault force was the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment, led by Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Jones, but BBC Radio straight up spoiled the surprise initially. At the time, they were broadcasting news as was happening, warning of the Goose Green attack. The Argentinian forces were tipped off, and then when the attack was finally underway come the morning of May 28th, Jones sadly lost his life heroically charging at the enemy post. The Argentinian garrison formally surrendered the following morning, and the late Herbert Jones received, as well as his successor of the battalion, Major Chris Keeble, they were both awarded medals. Jones received the Victoria Cross, while Keeble received the Distinguished Service Order. Two para were outnumbered and should have lost when comparing support, but they ended up taking down the entire Argentine garrison, more than twice their own size. Number 9. Bluff Cove. On June 8, 1982, British troop transport ships were attacked from the skies. Argentine air forces took the lives of 56 soldiers and wounding 150. British troops were in the middle of unloading when two waves of A-4 Skyhawks from Argentina's 5th Air Brigade attacked. The Skyhawks departed from Rio Gallegos Air Base, and originally 8 of them were on the way, but 3 had to turn back due to refueling issues. With warning signals not reaching Bluff Cove, around 2 p.m. local time, the first strike hit 2 ships, the RFA Tristram and the RFA Sir Galahad. At 4:50 p.m. local time, the second strike hit. This one sank an LSU from HMS Fearless. Number 8. The HMS Plymouth. Just because an explosive is a dud does not mean that it's not going to set everything ablaze. The HMS Plymouth is a Rothesay class frigate named of course after the English city, and it served the United Kingdom's Royal Navy from 1959 to 1988. This warship has since been decommissioned and opened to the public, but finally scrapped in 2014. The HMS Plymouth was one of the first Royal Navy ships to arrive in the South Atlantic once Argentine forces invaded the Falkland Islands. Plymouth, the Antrim, Brilliant, and Endurance all combined forces to recapture South Georgia on April 28th. This was Operation Parakeet. On June 8th, during the Bluff Cove air attack, Plymouth was hit from the skies, but the 4 explosions did not go off. They were all duds. One of them ended up hitting the flight deck, detonating a depth charge, and a fire broke out, but none of them really went off, you know what I'm saying? 5 men were injured on the Plymouth, but later on, in the wardroom of the ship, was where the surrender of the Argentine forces was signed by Lieutenant Commander Alfredo Astiz. So there's a lot of history in that one ship. Number 7. Battle of Mount Harriet. Taking place in the late hours of June 11, 1982, the Battle of Mount Harriet is one of the 3 main battles that took place during the Falklands War. And they happened all on the same night. I keep saying the dates also just to really drive that information into your head, but these operations went down roughly at the same exact time. The British had 42 Commando, Royal Marines, artillery support from a battery of 29 Commando Regiment, and Royal Artillery. British war correspondent John Witherow recalls the naval support at the Battle of Mount Harriet as blistering. Here's a quote from Witherow on the evening of June 11, 1982. "We were involved with one night attack on Mount Harriet when the Welsh's guards were coming up as backup. This involved marching for several hours on a very dark night through a minefield. Sporadic shell fire slowed our progress tremendously, and eventually we made a base out of Mount Harriet, which was coming under incredible fire from a frigate offshore. The whole mountain seemed to erupt in flame. It seemed impossible that anybody could survive an attack like that. And this went on for well over an hour, just shell after shell whistling over our heads and hitting the mountain. Eventually this was lifted and Marines went in. And to our amazement, there seemed to be an incredible amount of fighting going on. There was a lot of tracer fire. The whole night was being lit up by flares, which cast a dead, unrealistic pall over the whole scene." End quote. 26 soldiers were wounded, and both Corporal Lawrence G. Watts and Acting Corporal Jeremy Smith lost their lives in the Battle of Mount Harriet. Number 6. Mount Longdon. One of the most violent firefights of the Falklands War was the Battle of Mount Longdon. The night of June 11, 1982, many recall as one of the most horrifying. 23 members of the Parachute Regiment lost their lives while 47 others were injured. Veteran James O'Connell was 22 years old at the time. He recalls being at death's door. "I had dressings covering my face to stop the blood, and I remember being loaded onto a stretcher. I heard one of the guys carrying me saying, 'This one's alive,' and the others say, 'Is he? Well, let's take him back then.' There was a makeshift mortuary, and I think I was being taken there to be placed with the dead." End quote. He was literally on his way. I can't imagine what that feels like in numerous ways. O'Connell was hit in the head and face. A bullet went through his nose and right eye, just went through his cheekbone entirely. And on top of that, they couldn't even get helicopters to Mount Longdon for 12 hours, so O'Connell, as well as many others injured, had to just wait it out. The British forces consisted of 3rd Battalion, artillery support from 29 Commando Regiment, Royal Artillery, Parachute Regiment 3 Para under Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Pike.
Number 5. Of Rats and Men. The trenches were a messed up place to be for a human being. Seriously, I can't recommend it to anyone. But for a small rodent creature like a rat, it may as well be Caesar's Palace, Las Vegas. As a rat, you had access to food scraps, shelter, and everything a growing rat needs. They breed like crazy and had become commonplace amongst the soldiers and decaying bodies sinking in the hellish mud. The rats grew bigger and bolder, with some cases of rats stealing food right out of soldiers' hands. Sometimes there was so many that soldiers had to essentially hunt them in order to cull the numbers, as there was no system for removing them entirely. On a brighter note though, some soldiers kept them as pets to keep their minds off the impending doom of World War I and trench combat. So you know what, that's kind of cool, a little rat friend. I'll call him Ralph, I don't know why, Ralph's a cool name. Number 4, No Man's Land. This is what all the chaos is about. The part most soldiers quivering in their boots fear. Maybe it's better to stay with the rats and corpses and freeze. Most soldiers are waiting for one sound. That means two things. A whistle blowing means you're going over the top, or the enemy is coming to you. Either way, someone is going to have to cross No Man's Land, which is the space between two opposing trenches defended on either side with barbed wire, mines, and machine guns, waiting to cut down the enemy charging at full speed. No Man's Land earns its grim nickname as the bodies that fall out there will stay there and become a part of the battlefield. Rolling artillery barrages were meant to aid soldiers in crossing No Man's Land, but no amount of help, liquid courage, or any other factor could really prepare you for that first leap of faith, climbing over the top and facing the enemy. Number 3, Humanity. While a lot of soldiers met their demise to the new inventions of the war like chemical weapons and improved artillery, trench warfare brought out the worst in humanity. The idea of going over the top was to take the enemy trench. Doing so would move the front line up. A war of inches, if you will. However, you cannot take the enemy trench if the enemy is still there. And that is where the bayonets come in, gentlemen. Horrific as it may be, once you made it into the trenches, the warfare looked more like Stone Age fighting than modern. Swords, knives, rifles in close range, clubs, mallets, and homemade blunt objects, and sometimes fists, were used in an intimate setting of a muddy trench just to kill each other, often being some of the most brutal and intense fighting of the war. Even after all that, taking the trench was difficult, but defending it was more, as oftentimes armies went back and forth trying to break enemy lines in between trenches. No thanks. Number 2, Sharks with frickin' laser beams. Okay, I know the title's a little misleading, but hear me out. Airplanes and aviation had only been invented a few years prior, or at least a modernized version of them. So humans gained the ability to fly, something people of the past could only dream of. So what's the first thing humans do to this amazing revolutionary invention? Can we weaponize this? Yeah, it's kind of messed up to think about, but when we gained the ability to fly, one of the first real uses we used it for was to destroy each other. Airplanes did play a crucial role in World War I, but not just for ace pilots like the Red Baron, but for reconnaissance. At least the tank was designed for military application. Leave it up to us to strap an automatic weapon and bombs to one of the greatest gifts ever given to mankind. And the sharks with frickin' laser beams attached to their frickin' heads are the same energy. I think so, at least. Number 1, Merry Christmas. This would honestly confuse me if I was a soldier in World War I. It would make me question a lot of things. Things like, why am I here freezing and dying? And shooting at people I don't really have an issue with. The Christmas Truce of 1914 was a truce by the Entente and the Central Powers, more specifically on the Western Front, who climbed out of their trenches to shake hands and share a moment of peace on Christmas. The soldiers, for the most part, got along swimmingly. What's messed up is a few days later, they were back at it again with blowing up and destroying each other. Personally, I don't know how you could do that after sharing a beer with somebody. Just doesn't make any sense. Number 10, no half measures. In a time of great socialist revolution and trying to defeat the white royalist army, the socialist red army knew that they'd have to full send or no send. And what I mean by that is eliminate the royal family, so that the royalist army has no one to fight for or reinstall should the red army fail. Yeah, sadly this is true. Nicholas II and his wife and his children were terminated on July 17th, 1918. The whole family gone in a shooting that almost resembles a certain Al Capone related incident. Was this really necessary? I don't know. Would the Royalist Army have really tried to reinstall Nicky or someone else since they were backed by other foreign powers? Regardless, this still happened and the Red Army was victorious, ushering in the birth of the USSR and the start of communism. Also, arguably the start of the Cold War, but that's debatable. Number 9. The cost of revolution. War is war, and that means a tragic loss of life. The Russian Civil War is no different in that statement. That being said, the Russian Civil War is the most costly civil war in history. It's a Guinness record, so you know it's official. An estimated 1.5 million combatants would perish in the battle between white and red. Worse than that, an estimated 8 million civilians lost their lives. It was a brutal civil war, especially for the civilian population, as food was short and disease was high. I am sure after the war was over, the communists were super nice to the people and in no way restricted freedoms or persecuted certain groups with large prison-like work camps where people were disposed of and worked until they could not work anymore. I'm sure that didn't happen at all, right guys? Right? It happened. It actually did happen. It's pretty bad. Number 8. Secure the keys! Oh, what? You mean the communists did not treat their people very well and ran a very brutal and powerful regime the second they had secured victory? Oh man, I never would have seen that coming. Yes, unfortunately for the people of the USSR, things were not so great. A fine example of things not being so great was the gulags. No, not the ones in war zone, real gulags. Labor camps where anyone the government felt was a threat to communism, criminals, POWs, and just about anyone they wanted to do away with were put in a gulag. But hold your comment typing fingers, my Call of Duty audience, because one of the worst gulags was Vorkuta. Yes, that's right. From Black Ops 1, Vorkuta was a labor camp that focused on mining and logging, and the prisoners were quite literally worked or starved to death. Working labor-intensive jobs on a diet fit for a rat, speaking of which, rats and cats and dogs were often resorted to just to have a belly full of grub. This was just how the USSR dealt with things after the war. Step 8, Reznov! Freedom! For you, Mason! Not for me! Number 7. Bread, peace, and death. Vladimir Lenin was the father of communism in Russia. It's why you see statues of the bald-headed hero everywhere, and that goatee he has, so pointy and sharp. He could poke a hole in any stinky bourgeoisie capitalist ideas. Unfortunately for the hunky communist hero, his time to enjoy the socialist utopia he and his cadres dreamed of would literally be short-lived. After gaining enough power to throw elections, the Soviets lost. But they decided elections might be a stinky imperialist idea anyway, so that was scrapped. And the Soviets took power. Oh, and Civil War time. That's right, that's what we're talking about. Just as Lenin was about to sit down and start doing government stuff, the Civil War broke out. The poor guy could use a break, and he got one in a series of strokes that seriously disabled the evil doppelganger of Uncle Pennybags. That's the Monopoly Man, in case you didn't understand that reference. He shortly would pass due to his failing health, and with his last words told the people to not let Stalin be in charge. Stalin then became in charge. Number 6. No one is safe. Trotsky, one of the founding fathers of Soviet Russia, surprisingly good military leader and an excellent organizer for the party. Besides his wacky haircut, it's just kinda weird, the man was well respected and played a crucial role in Russia's revolution and civil war. That means he was loved forever and lived a long life in his socialist utopia. Well, sadly for poor Trotsky, he became a victim of Stalinization. History's second favorite mustache man was ruthless to say the least, and after some political disagreements and organizing, Trotsky was banished from the Soviet Union, moving a couple times throughout Soviet-influenced Europe, where he would eventually end up in Mexico City. That's not in Europe, there's supposed to be a comma there. Maybe leaving the Soviet Union was a good thing. Maybe some fun in the hot Mexican sun would be great. Hey, what's that guy in the black suit doing? And why does he have an ice pick? Trotsky was assassinated by Stalin in 1940. Even someone as powerful as Trotsky was not safe from the wrath of the USSR. Imagine killing the guy that starts your country. That's why we shoot George Washington. That's crazy.
Number 5. Passing time. You would assume the Civil War and being part of it and everything I've talked about would give you enough anxiety, but gambling was also a common pastime in between battles. And when I say gambling, I don't mean, okay, it's nighttime, let's throw a few bucks down and play dominoes. No, they would gamble on everything. Horse races, chess, euchre, poker, checkers, cards were popular until the end of the Civil War, when of course they were harder to come by, being so flimsy and all. And when dominoes and cards were out of the picture, soldiers would really go old school and play leapfrog. Yeah, games like that were literally all they had. They would wrestle each other for fun, they would have foot races and bet on them. Bowling would be played using cannonballs to knock down wooden pins, and baseball was also played, but it was a little different back then to how we remember it now. The ball was a lot softer, and there were sometimes only 2 bases. The only way you were out also was if you were hit by the ball, hence the softness that I mentioned. Number 4. coldest winters. With the winter winds rolling in occasionally, soldiers could no longer play baseball outside and peg each other with baseballs, but what you could do was hit each other with snowballs. A little fun, also a little scary. They called it a snow battle. Yeah, a snow battle too. Battle, way more intense. Soldiers would leave with bruises, black eyes, and sometimes even broken bones. Yeah, these guys were blowing off lots of steam, and they would plan attacks and take it obviously seriously, as they did with their daily civil duties. Even officers got in on this action. When pieces of ice were no longer available to large units to throw at one's head, other winter games would include skating and sledding. Number 3. Food March. In April 1863, a group of mostly women led a march to get the governor's attention. The governor at the time, John Letcher, was joined by President Jefferson Davis. It did not end well. The food situation in the South was not great because food prices changed depending on the status of the war. Outcomes of the battle directly affected prices because they were linked to the CSA's currency. That plus the fact that invading troops from the north would often burn crops when they came through, it was getting worse over time. Come April 1863, this march of women broke windows. They flipped carts until eventually they drew out Governor John Letcher and President Jefferson Davis. John Letcher literally started to throw cash at the protesters. Now they still didn't stop, obviously, that didn't solve problems. It was so bad that the militia almost had to open fire. Number 2. The Alligator. I mentioned soldiers and hot air balloons, so I must mention the United States Navy's first submarine. How fun. This 47-foot long submarine that was paddle powered, yep, you heard me, paddle powered, so you'd be inside and you would do this. We can't call it the USS Alligator because it technically didn't see any active days of combat. In fact, the Alligator, that's what I'll call it, had to be cut loose on its first mission. It was being towed behind the USS Sumter on April 2nd, 1863, right off North Carolina when bad weather hit. The Alligator went down and we haven't found it since. It's still out there. The Alligator is still lurking out there. Only a few months after this new weapon went down, the Confederate States of America launched their own sub, the H.L. Huntley, and it sank the USS Housatonic near the coast of Charleston, officially marking the first time a submarine sank an enemy ship. It also immediately sank afterwards, taking the lives of 8 crewmen, so even in victory, you're not safe. They made history but only enjoyed it for minutes. This is all tragic. Number 1. The wage gap. Hundreds of women joined the Civil War and they did so by looking like men. Yeah, they would pull a she's the man and get to work. But the thing is, like I mentioned before, with the CSA's currency being affected by the status of the war, soldiers were getting $13 a month roughly. That's double what a woman could make anywhere on the planet, so they really had no choice but to join. This was long before women's suffrage, so if they thought you were a man, you could use that $13 how you wanted. So it comes to no surprise that women would keep this disguise even after the war ended. In 1909, the US Army officially denied that any woman was ever enlisted in the military service of the United States as a member of any organization of the regular or volunteer army at any time during the period of the Civil War. During the Civil War, though, that was the first time in American history when women all came together in a war effort. Thousands of women from the North and South volunteered as nurses.
Number 10. Queen of the Red Sails. In history, when men drop the ball, there's always an iron-willed woman to pick up the slack. Not because a man is telling her to, but because she wants to. How about inheriting a whole pirate fleet from your late husband? Meet Zhang Yisao. Her husband had managed to build quite the little nautical empire, and with his untimely passing, she became the boss. She commanded a fleet of over 400 ships, and estimated between 20 to 60,000 pirates at her peak. She's noted for organizing and uniting pirates into a confederation. She also had some imperial entanglements, having entered conflict with the East India Company and the Portuguese Empire. This is a lot to go through, especially when I get anxiety from being left alone at the cashier at the grocery store. Number 9. Double Trouble. The Trung sisters from Vietnam are still celebrated today because, honey, they went through a lot. The sisters led the first resistance against Chinese dominance, which at the time had lasted over 247 years. Many believe Vietnam wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for their efforts, gathering 80,000 people to join their cause, once killing a tiger and writing a proclamation of war on its hide. They managed to hold off the Chinese forces for 3 years before finally being overtaken. The Trung sisters are a great deal of national pride and pride amongst many women in Vietnam. Sadly, the Chinese proved too strong. But to prevent capture, the sisters later drowned in a last fit of defiance. Number 8. Hell hath no fury. The Roman Empire was just about good at everything. Politics, culture, building a city that would stand the test of time, and eventually outlive their civilization. But perhaps the Romans' strongest attribute was their military. I mean, come on, it's Rome, no introduction is needed here. So when a man was worried that the Romans he had worked with might take over his homeland after he had passed, he left a note in his will saying, "Please do not take this. This is mine, don't take it." I'll give the folks at home a second to think about what the Romans did next. If you guessed annex his homeland and do non-YouTube friendly conduct things to his wife and daughter, you'd be correct. His wife Boudica, not feeling so cool about what happened, took some action by gathering the tribe together and revolting against the Romans. Defeating the scrambled Romans in a battle, she then made her way to Londinium, or what's now London, and had it burned. There were empires that couldn't take down the Roman Empire, and Boudica did it like it was nothing. They did end up losing and, once again to avoid capture, drank poison. But come on, she took down the Romans. Number 7. Viva la Revolucion. Juana de Paria was born in Spanish-controlled Peru to two loving parents. Like many classic stories, her mother sadly passed away when she was young, where she grew very attached to her father. Although unusual for the time, her father instructed her on how to horse ride and sharpshoot. Even helped her father work during the days. They were pretty tight, but like an M. Night Shyamalan movie, there's a double twist. Her father passed away in her teens. Now an orphan, she was forced to move in with her aunt, where she quite possibly developed the very first feelings of teenage angst before there was ever an Avril Lavigne album. Juana would often have outbursts that got her eventually sent to become a nun, where that also did not go very well. During her studies, she was fond of Joan of Arc, but eventually she was expelled at a young age of 17. After years of witnessing colonial reign, she joined the revolution. She became so passionate about the cause, she once fought a battle while pregnant, went back to have a baby, and then went back to battle with the baby strapped to her back. Man, sometimes I don't even want to get up after a large meal. What a woman! Number 6. Not one step back. Ludmila Pavlichenko was just like any other girl in Russia in the 1940s. She was in her last year of university when history's favorite mustache man invaded history's second favorite mustache man. Feeling inspired by her country's call to arms, she signed up for military service. She would eventually find her way to be a sharpshooter. During the siege of Odessa, she is credited with 187 confirmed kills. She married a fellow sniper, he died, then she went on to have over 300 confirmed kills when the war was over. Once the military realized how valuable she was pulled from the front lines, where she became key propaganda for Russia. She would also find herself training young snipers up until the end of the war. She was oftentimes referred to as the Lady of Death. Number 5. Civil rights. If you know the 1960s, then you know it was a decade of change. A lot of history to unfold in just 10 years. Again, we could probably do a whole video on that. The Vietnam War is especially important towards the civil rights movement, as black Americans were a big part of the war effort in Vietnam. Black soldiers were nothing new to the American military, but their integration with white soldiers was. Every war previous, soldiers of different skin color were separated into different units. While most soldiers got along, there was still a long way to go, as black soldiers were still often mistreated. It seemed, however, that in a war zone, white Americans and black Americans were fine, but at home had tensions. We could do a whole video on civil rights and segregation, but to sum it up, racial relations made Americans ask questions. And for black Americans, the question is, how is someone expected to fight a war in a foreign country that we really have no business being in, for a country that won't allow a certain group of citizens to even buy a cup of coffee because they're not allowed to enter the building due to the color of their skin? Just doesn't make sense, man. Number 4. Mattel 16. The 1960s saw a lot of technological development. The extensive use of the helicopter comes to mind. During the early years of the Vietnam War, Americans were issued a brand new rifle. The M16 was a brand new design that flopped as hard as it could, as it tended not to work, which, if you're in a war, is kind of not what you want to happen. Your stuff's kind of gotta work. A rumor had spread around that the firearm never needed to be cleaned, which in a jungle setting with mud and rain just doesn't make any sense. This, with already existing flaws, made it jam and was rendered useless by soldiers. Nicknamed the Mattel 16 after the toy company, some soldiers were forced to use enemy weapons, which sadly in some cases may have led to fatal incidents of friendly fire. Number 3. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. Another very useful tool in destroying the Vietnamese jungle. Trees are made of wood, and wood burns, so set them ablaze. Except napalm is different. A chemical compound meant to burn at a very hot temperature of 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and it would burn for a while. This was used in multiple ways, but probably the most effective with airstrikes. While not the first time firebombing had been used, as it was proven effective in the firebombing of Japan during World War II, the Vietnam War saw almost the same amount of ordnance dropped, napalm and others included, as used in all of World War II by America. That is an insane statistic. It had a terrible effect on people as it can burn skin off. The most infamous picture from the Vietnam War had something to do with this. We can't show it to you, but you've probably honestly seen it already. The military would later disband its use, as the ability to control napalm's destructive power is limited. Number 2. GI Kebab. While the Viet Cong may not have won many battles against the US, they were still formidable fighters. They had the lay of the land and laid traps everywhere. From 1965 to 1970, 11% of American casualties were related to Viet Cong placed traps. What's so messed up in that is that in a modern war with modern technology, a lot of the traps the Viet Cong were using were something out of the Stone Age, but still deadly. Improvised explosives, swinging spiked balls, tripwires, single shot cartridges, and snake pits right out of Indiana Jones. I can't even believe that's real. But the most effective were punji pits, or punji sticks. A large hole is dug and bamboo spikes are placed at the bottom. Then, out of pure evil, urine or human excrement is put on the spikes. A thin layer of leaves or cover is placed on the trap, so when someone comes along they would fall in a pit of spikes, that if that didn't kill them, an infection from the waste would, or make recovery very, very miserable. That is cruel, man. That ain't right, man. That ain't right, Chief. Number 1. Apocalypse Now. Tiger Force was a long-range reconnaissance unit that later became known for its acts of war crimes. Not sure if there could be war crimes when everyone's doing naughty things, but okay. To quote Martin Sheen in Apocalypse Now, charging someone with murder around here is like handing out speeding tickets at the Indy 500. And like a scene right out of that movie, the members of Tiger Force had a tradition to make necklaces out of ears. I'm going to say that again. They made necklaces out of ears. There are a number of things Tiger Force committed that are honestly just not safe for life. But that's war at the end of the day. War is hell. Number 10. Hold the mustard, please. World War I cannot be talked about without talking about the crazy advancements in technology. Seemingly, nations and empires were just itching to try them out on each other. Airplanes, tanks, blimps, machine guns, mostly fairly new and extremely lethal. However, the life of a World War I soldier cannot be talked about without talking about mustard gas or chemical weapons. In 1907, major world players agreed to ban chemical weapons from warfare. So you can understand the confusion by Allied soldiers on the Second Battle of Ypres when over 150 tons of chlorine gas were released. A terrible weapon that would cause trouble breathing, burns, and vomiting. It was so effective that the Allies immediately began working on their own chemical weapons and gas masks to prevent the effects of this supervillain level weapon. I think this quote by World War II General MacArthur sums it up. Whoever said the pen is mightier than the sword obviously never encountered automatic weapons. He's not wrong. He's not wrong. Number 9. All quiet on the Western Front. This is kind of obvious, but people die in war. In World War I, a lot of people died, and a lot of these young men and comrades in arms formed bonds with one another, only to have those friends and brothers be killed and taken away from each other. Over 2 million German soldiers would perish in the First World War, which later would have all kinds of disastrous effects on the country, especially with the rise of Evil Mustache Man. France also lost a similar amount of men. Trench warfare was brutal, and I'll get to that shortly. One of my favorite books and movies, actually, All Quiet on the Western Front, depicts a group of young German boys who are in this thing together, all while having a strong anti-war message, or at least questioning the legitimacy of the First World War. Just make sure when you're in the trenches, no one's handing you those fresh new boots. It's an omen. Number 8. 1-star review. It may come as a surprise to some of you, but living in the trenches on the Western Front wasn't a super fun time. We don't recommend it here at Bumblebee. If you're like me, then you love a good hearty meal. Like my mom always said, I'm a meat and potato kind of guy. That's just how it goes. A nice grilled rare steak, roasted garlic potatoes, and a freshly tossed crisp lettuce Caesar salad. Ooh, that sounds amazing. I'm kind of hungry now. And maybe a beer or two to wash it down. Just a classic meal for a classic guy that I really enjoy. Sadly for the boys in the trenches, this could not have been further from reality. Anyone in the military today with our modern technology will tell you how delicious MRE rations are. But for soldiers of the First World War, rations were limited. And as time went on, especially on the German side, where in 1918 rations were whittled down to turnip soup and turnip bread. Ugh. There were still beer rations. However, and if I'm going to be shot at, I still want a little ale to cure what ails me. You know what I'm saying? Go a long way. Number 7. Trench living. I know after a long day of work, most folks like to kick back and relax. A nice warm house, a cold beer, maybe the game's on. You come home to a family that loves you. The life of a soldier in World War I was more of the horrific variety. Basically, you live in a deep hole that stretches for miles and interconnects with tunnels and other trenches. It's freezing cold in the winter, blistering hot in the summer. Rain's right on top of you, and the mud. Oh, the mud is an issue. Bogged down in a muddy hole, wet freezing with other miserable men who are also wet and freezing. Just not a fun time for anyone involved. I love winter and a good rainstorm here and there, but the difference is I get to come out of the cold after a long day making snow angels or jumping in puddles. The impending doom and being soaking wet would damper anyone's mood. Number 6. Disease in a time of plague. While living in a trench for long periods of time may suck, there's other things besides spooky spiked helmeted Germans waiting to kill you. Bullets, bombs, and artillery are lethal, but you had a very high chance of dying from disease. A lot of these trenches became isolated from supply lines for multiple reasons, and sometimes could be a logistical nightmare, meaning supplies were oftentimes difficult to come by. But no amount of supply could fix the disgusting living conditions of the trenches. Soldiers claimed by the war would often just rot, as recovering fallen comrades was made difficult in trench warfare, making diseases very easy to catch. Besides influenza and typhoid, the most common sickness would be trench foot, or gangrene, where really the only thing to treat it is a trip to the medic's hut with a saw blade to amputate your foot, in which is a pain I cannot even begin to imagine. No thank you. You ever seen 127 Hours? It's kind of the same thing.
Number 5. Lozen. Lozen was a Chichihene Chiricahua Apache combatant who fought for the freedom of her people from the San Carlos Reserve in Arizona. Operating under the command of her brother Victorio, Lozen was famed for leading refugees across the Rio Grande and guiding a mother and child across the Chihuahuan Desert, supposedly even taking down a longhorn with just a knife to silently acquire supplies. Returning to the front, Lozen was eventually captured, passing away as a prisoner of war, but her tale lives on as a legendary warrior. Number 4. Boudica. Upon the death of Iceni king Prasutagus, he issued a will that proclaimed both of his daughters and the Emperor Nero to be his heirs. His will was ignored by the Romans, and the kingdom was subsumed by the Britannian province, Roman soldiers sent to ensure its delivery into Nero's hands. What happened from there was an utterly vile razing of Iceni lands. Prasutagus' wife Boudica and his daughters were tortured and their people massacred. Boudica, incensed with the desperation of revenge, organized an uprising and led an army of Iceni warriors to regain their liberty. They responded to the brutalities committed against them in kind, ensuring that even if they did not win, then the Romans would at least understand the grave error they'd made in taking their land. Number 3. Fuhau. One of the strongest generals in Chinese history, Fuhau worked as both a priest and a warrior. She married into Wu Ding's household and worked her way up the ranks, making her way to the position of second queen. From there, she engaged in military activities and rituals, overseeing numerous campaigns in the name of the Shang dynasty. She is also credited with the earliest known usage of the ambush tactic in Chinese history. While exceptional from current knowledge of this period, it should be noted that the Shang dynasty frequently employed women as soldiers within their armies. Even so, her achievements were so great that, on her passing, Fuhau was buried with 130 weapons, along with several human sacrifices and a massive amount of jade and other assorted objects. Number 2. Zenobia. One of the greatest Syrian rulers, Septima Zenobia rose to power through marrying King Odenathus, who was assassinated by the jealous Maeonius, who lasted as emperor for all of about 5 minutes before being killed by his own soldiers. Though her son was set to rule, he was also, 10, so Zenobia was made the regent. Consolidating power, Zenobia began to expand her borders eastward, her regency slowly turning into just plain old rule. Declaring her son to be the emperor, she became the de facto empress, and continued to rule. Beloved by her people, she made the kingdom a place of learning and religious tolerance, striving to make sure that the multiple peoples under her rule were treated fairly and well. While she initially attempted to avoid conflict with Rome, they did clash after the whole, she became an empress thing. The result did end up in Zenobia's loss, and she was captured by the Romans, who apparently spared her. And accounts from what happened then are sketchy at best. We may not know what exactly happened, but the empire she made was certainly one to remember. Number 1. Nzinga. Queen of the Mbundu kingdoms in the land of Angola, Nzinga initially began her career in politics as an ambassador to the Portuguese, whom the Mbundu were constantly at war with. When her father passed, her brother Mbandi came to power, attempting to consolidate his strength and continue warring with the Portuguese. He used his sister as a diplomat to attempt for peace. However, the Portuguese demeaned and belittled her, furnishing their rooms with chairs for themselves and a floor mat for her. Undaunted, Nzinga had her attendant form her chair and spoke with the diplomats eye to eye, securing a peace treaty. This was short-lived, however, and Mbandi eventually had to abdicate the throne to her. From there, she led a war against the Portuguese and the Mbangolans, taking the Matamba lands and growing her forces through a mixture of carefully plotted and ingenious exploitations of cultural rules and rights. She warred with Portugal for 25 years, wearing down their forces until peace talks began, aided by the Portuguese stirring conflict with Spain. Nzinga would then begin to tentatively integrate Christianity into her kingdom, and strove to ensure that no wars of succession would occur after her passing.
Kicking off the list at number 10, A Day in the Life. So as soon as the sun came up, your life as a Civil War soldier began. You would train day in, day out, preparing for battle. It was important that each soldier knew their role to work together as a unit. Now, I would say that there's no time for fun and games, but they always made time to blow some steam off. In between drills, soldiers would do chores just like we do every day. They would cook meals, do laundry, clean gear, and make sure that everything is smooth. Passing the time was done by playing dominoes or poker. Reading was of course a popular way of passing the time as well, but it was a lot harder to get your hands on a book back then, especially when you're running around between marches and battles. So more often than not, soldiers would trade newspapers with their opponents. You would hear about the Christmas peace treaty, but this would happen as well. They would just trade papers. A soldier named Milton Barrett, stationed in the 18th Georgia Volunteers, wrote about this back in 1863. He said, "Our regiment had just come off picket. We stood close together and could talk to each other. Then when the officers were not present, we exchanged papers and bartered tobacco for coffee." They would do it when the officers weren't looking. That's the most intriguing part. They would manage this by using a small boat. Tricky, always a way. The first aerial photograph was back in 1860. James Wallace Black took this photo not by using drones or any bowling alley crazy technology we have today, but rather just a hot air balloon. This lovely landscape is the town of Boston, and you're looking at it from 2,000 feet. This was a long time before selfie sticks. Even longer before that, hot air balloons were being used in warfare. The first account of a hot air balloon being used was The first account of a hot air balloon being used in war was 1794, when the French Committee of Public Safety created the Corps d'Astrociers, which is a hot air balloon squad. They were used in the Battle of Charleroi and Fleurus, and then 70 years later, they were used in the American Civil War. They were pretty large as well. They could fit around 5 guys, where smaller balloons like the Eagle and Excelsior only carried 1 soldier. Those were for stealth flights. That'd be pretty brave. Imagine seeing a hot air balloon coming over the horizon and it has soldiers shooting at you. That's incredible. I didn't hear about any of this growing up. They could reach up to 1,000 feet, so they definitely had a vantage point like no other, and they would communicate with soldiers on the ground using flag signals or of course telegraphs. The most successful balloon program in the Union was under the command of Thaddeus Lowe. He and Lincoln were allies, and Lowe actually sent a telegraph to Lincoln once describing the view of Washington from above. Call your friends more and describe your view to them. You might get a few things done. Number 8. Bounty jumpers. Fewer than 150 Union soldiers were killed for desertion, and Lincoln was actually constantly writing letters and endorsements reducing soldier sentences from death to labor during the war. That's how bad it got. Deserters were a big problem for both the Confederate and Union armies, so it was punishable by death. After the Battle of Fredericksburg, the Union had 100 deserters roughly a day. That's a lot, every single day. The Union actually used peer pressure at one point just to keep soldiers from leaving. In 1863, the Union offered regiment perks if a certain percentage of original men were on for a following tour of duty. So soldiers inside were making others stay on board. How they did that, what they said, We don't know. Bounty jumpers were men who were paid to fill on the spot of newly drafted soldiers. So these guys would join for a few days and then desert them all over again and join a new post as the new substitute and get paid. And of course, some deserters were branded to avoid this problem. Number 7. Daily diet. These soldiers were all around 25 years old. The minimum age to join, of course, was 18, but a lot of these guys who were that young would often lie about their age anyways on paper. So on paper, the average was 25 years. But these guys were kids, basically. They ate mostly crackers, and when I say crackers, I don't mean the salty work snacks that you have today. These were made of like flour and water and just salt called hardtack. They would eat berries, nuts, and fruits, anything they could find is all they had. Most of these soldiers were close to starving to death. Number 6. Soldiers protest. 1/3 of the Union soldiers were immigrants, and 1 in 10 were African American, and those soldiers actually refused their salaries for 18 months to protest being paid lower wages than white soldiers. When black soldiers were signing up in the Union Army in 1863, they were only getting $10 a month, while white soldiers were getting around $13 a month. Officers were getting $700 a month too. It was just insane. To make things even worse, black soldiers were then hit with a $3 monthly cleaning fee, bringing that down to $7 a month now. So a protest was in order and it was held for 18 months, and then come September 1864, black soldiers received equal pay that was retroactive to their enlistment date, so they finally were able to send money back to their families after that long.
Number 6. Flama. Here's something new I learned. That's how you know it's going to be a good video, folks. I actually learned something, I know. Flama was a Roman gladiator, perhaps of Syrian descent, or maybe Roman, we're not exactly sure. However, the story goes like this. The Roman Colosseum, big stands with big fans, maybe even some snacks too. It may be a blood sport, but you gotta have some grub. Personally, I'm a ballpark dog kind of guy. 1 shot of mustard, 1 shot of ketchup, please. Anyway, I digress. Flama was a very interesting gladiator. Unlike most others, he took part in a lot of battles, probably the most. And like a lot of others, he was taken to become a fighter at such a young age, so he could earn his freedom. So he fights for his freedom, that's kind of crazy. The thing with Flama is that he won 4 times. Won his freedom 4 times. And each time he refused and continued to fight. It's more of a, I'm not locked in here with you situation, you're locked in here with me situation. I'm good at Call of Duty sometimes. That's gonna count for something though, right? I'm not a gladiator, but I can play Call of Duty, that's good, right? Number 5, Alexander the Great. Everyone has ups and downs except for Alexander the Great. Besides a few skirmishes here and there, he was pretty much undefeated. That's a pretty good record. But he was like 10-0, and if this was Call of Duty Search and Destroy, that's good enough for me. The Macedonian prince's empire stretched thousands of miles from Greece to northern Africa, Persia, and even some parts of India. He accomplished all of this at a very, very young age. So, you know, get off your lazy butt and do something. That means me too. I just love being a homebody, what can I say? Although, I do enjoy the odd drinky poo with friends. Yeah. There's a famous quote, and I think this explains pretty much all of it. And Alexander wept, for he had no more worlds to conquer. Tragic. It's hard being a #1 top ancient warrior guy. It really is. It's really hard. Number 4, Mad Jack Churchill. This guy needs to be talked about more, man. He's so awesome. WW2. Germany was back for the sequel, and this time with its other tough guy friend Japan and their little paisano Italy. The boys were back in town and ready to party. Mad Jack Churchill got the invitation and brought some party favors with him. What did he bring, you're asking? Well, my fellow humble bumblebees, he brought a sword and a bow and bagpipes with him, which, if you didn't know, that's ancient stuff. But he brought it to a modern war. What? What's so weird about it? This is World War II. Swords and bows just aren't it anymore. They don't belong there. In fact, Mad Jack Churchill has the last recorded longbow D-Life in history. He has been noted to play Scotland the Brave when the enemy had him in their sights. He was captured multiple times and escaped multiple times. Walking like thousands of miles to get out of there. Kind of crazy. When the war ended, he was genuinely upset it was over. He thought it was more of a game. Hollywood, if you're listening, someone make this movie or TV show. I'll play him. I'll do it. I'll come play in Scotland the Brave. Number 3, Kangaskhan. Sometimes in life you make an impact in history. Sometimes you do so much it's hard not to talk about you. Kangas got to write his own history. The ruthless and powerful warrior from the Mongol Empire. Basically, it goes down like this. You got something he wants, albeit land to camp on, people for his empire, or just riches in general. Now, while he deletes your village and kingdom, you got two options. Option 1, if you don't agree with the terms and conditions of option 2, then the chaos of option 1 continues. Or option 2, assimilate into our empire or refer to the consequences of option 1. Ooh, I'll take option 2 thanks, I like to live. But keep your religious freedom though, for some reason. He let people keep their religious freedom, which is kind of cool. Even for a bloodthirsty monster, he was kind of cool with that. So gold star, buddy, gold star. And of course the classic fact that he did so much bedroom stuff that his DNA is still with us today and has way too many descendants than we like to admit. That's just crazy, man. That's insanity. That's insanity. Number 2, Navy SEALs. Oh baby, some real slick frogmen. These are the guys that are sent behind enemy lines and gather vital intelligence. Some of the best. It doesn't get tougher than the Navy SEALs. Finding their roots in the Vietnam War, the Navy SEALs have been one of the toughest special forces the United States has ever seen. They've been involved in almost every major conflict the US has found themselves entangled with for the last 60 years. For me, when I think Navy SEALs, I think of the classic PS2 game. Remember that? Remember that game? I remember that game. It's pretty sick. Let's put that game back. Game was super ahead of its time. And number 1, Spetsnaz. The spearhead of Russian special forces. These are tough guys with a tough history and ironically enough to mirror the history of the previously mentioned Navy SEALs. Getting their start as advisors to the VC in the Vietnam War and of course being a part of every major conflict the Soviet Union was a part of, and even the ones you may not know about. There's also a common rumor that the Spetsnaz trainees are given a pet. Sometimes it's a chicken or it's a dog, not too sure there, the information's not great, which kind of hurts the validity of the rumor, but the point stands nonetheless. Their duty is to basically raise and love and nurture this pet until an officer instructs them to take the pet to greener pastures. Yeah, no thanks.
In 10th place, we have Unsinkable Sam. I thought I'd start off the list with something sort of fluffy, and what's better for that than a very good kitty? The black and white cat was originally named Oscar and started his career in the fleet of the Yahtzee regime, the Kriegsmarine, and ended it in the Royal Navy. He was on board the Bismarck, the HMS Cossack, and the HMS Ark Royal. All three of those ships had a single thing in common, and yep, they sank, and this kitty survived them all. Originally on the Bismarck, only 118 humans from its crew of over 2,200 survived. Little Oscar was found floating on a board and picked up from the water, the only survivor to be rescued by the British destroyer, HMS Cossack. For a few months, all went smoothly, until sadly the ship was hit by a torpedo, and once again the precious kitty was found clinging to a piece of plank. He made it through the ordeal and was brought to the shore establishment in Gibraltar. Unsinkable Sam was then adopted by the crew of the HMS Ark Royal, which ironically was a ship that was instrumental in sinking the Bismarck. Ark Royal survived several near misses and gained a reputation as a lucky ship, a fitting home for the lucky kitty. The Germans incorrectly reported the ship as sunk on multiple occasions, but the luck didn't last, and were returning from Malta on November 14th of 1941, this ship too was torpedoed. This time, Sam was found clinging to a floating plank by a motor launch and described as angry but unharmed. At this point, Sam had enough of sea life. He was transferred to a job on land and spent the rest of his days hunting mice in the building of the Governor General. In 9th place, time to visit the London Zoo. So in the late 30s, everyone sorta knew war was coming and prepared accordingly, and the London Zoo in particular was no exception. War broke out on September 3rd of 1939, and at precisely 11 a.m., the zoological gardens were closed by order of the government, as were all other public places where people gathered in large numbers. Zoo records show that some of the zoo's most valuable animals were transferred to Whipsnade for safety, including 2 giant pandas, 2 orangutans, 4 chimpanzees, 3 Asian elephants, and an ostrich. That's almost a Christmas carol. Here's the sad part though. All of the venomous animals were killed to remove the possibility of having dangerous animals escape the zoo if the zoo were, kaboomed. However, some reptiles were saved, among them the Komodo dragon and Chinese alligators. 2 large wooden boxes around 8 feet long by 4 feet wide and 2 feet deep were built to accommodate 2 huge pythons, one 28 feet long and the other 25 feet long. The most valuable fish were kept and housed in tubs and tanks in the tortoise house, where the glass was crisscrossed with sticky tape to prevent it from, well, shattering. In 8th place, we have Kasai's Castle. Sitting on a gorgeous wooded hilltop in Wałbrzych in southwest Poland, Kasai's Castle was seized by the Yahtzees from the Royals in 1941 as their evil leaders' future residence. A maze of tunnels and bunkers were built using forced labor from the nearby Gross Rosen concentration camp, but the complex was not completed at the end of the war. Some say that the complex was the headquarters of the Yahtzee Command. Others believe that the tunnels might have housed an arms factory or a nuclear weapons laboratory. Let me know in the comments what you think it would have housed. In 7th place, we have the Amber Room. The incredible Amber Room was considered to be the 8th wonder of the world and was a gift to Peter the Great to celebrate peace between Russia and Prussia in 1716. Try saying that 5 times fast. It was created in Prussia and the construction began in 1701, but when Peter saw the room and expressed his admiration, King Frederick William I offered it as a gift and had it shipped to St. Petersburg in 18 boxes. Tsarina Elizabeth moved the room again, this time to the Catherine Palace in Pushkin in 1755. The already impressive room was expanded and renovated, and when completed, it covered 55 square meters and contained approximately 13,000 pounds of amber and other valuables. The amber panels were adorned with gold leaf, and historians believe the room was worth about 400 million in today's money. When Schmittler initiated Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, on June 22nd of 1941, approximately 3 million soldiers entered the USSR. When the marauding German army entered Pushkin, the curators of the Catherine Palace desperately tried to disassemble and hide the precious amber room. But the Germans found it, tore it down within 36 hours, and shipped it to Kaliningrad in 27 crates. In late 1943, the curator of the museum where it was being held was told to dismantle the amber room yet again and store it elsewhere. The city was kaboomed by the Allies in August of 1944, and the whereabouts of the room are still unknown. Theories from historians vary, with one saying the museum curator didn't follow orders, so it was destroyed in the big kaboom, while another theory is that the amber was loaded onto a ship and is located at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. Apparently there's a curse on the amber room as well, seeing as a number of people connected with it have met untimely deaths. The museum curator and his wife died from typhus, while a Russian intelligence officer died in a car crash immediately after talking about the amber room to a journalist. So if you never see me again, you know why. In 6th place, we have a ghost plane. Couldn't help myself, had to talk about ghosties at some point today. Our tale takes place on December 8th of 1942, which was a year and a day after the attack on Pearl Harbor. That was what brought the United States into, the war. The American Navy was on duty at Pearl Harbor when suddenly its radar picked up an odd reading. It seemed as if a lone plane was making its way from Japan and heading right into American airspace. It was late at night and the sky was overcast. Previous attacks had never occurred under those conditions. The radar operators were rightfully puzzled, but they sent 2 pilots to intercept the craft since they were not taking any chances. When they reached the plane, the pilots were shocked to find out that it was a P-40 with markings that hadn't been used since that attack. Once they got near the plane, they found that it had been shot to pieces and its landing gear was destroyed. They also saw the plane's pilot slumped over the cockpit with his suit stained by fresh red fluid. Incredibly, the pilot moved slightly, smiling and waving at the Americans. The plane plummeted to the ground and crashed in a field. When the 2 pilots investigated the crash site, they found the wreckage, but no sign of the pilot. The search team also found a diary that showed that the plane was stationed in Mindanao, approximately 1,300 miles away. The lack of landing gear made it an extremely difficult mystery to solve, and still has not been solved. How could a pilot survive the attack on Pearl Harbor for a year? Also, how did he manage to land and take off with no landing gear? I guess we'll never know.
Number 5, the Korean War. A war that is frankly just not talked about enough, and sadly I feel like the veterans don't get enough praise, so thank you. Now back to the mildly funny content. Korea was finding itself in quite a pickle. The same pickle that 40 other nations throughout the Cold War would find themselves in. Capitalism and communism were going to have a fight in their backyard. And it was going to be costly. Both sides supported their own not so nice dictator, and a bloody conflict ensued. Despite the UN and US efforts, and despite the Chinese and Soviet efforts, things kinda ended in the worst stalemate ever. As even today the tensions exist, Korea remains split in 2 by the ideologies. And North Korea is still a little crazy. Just a little bit. Number 4, Up and Away. Back when history's second favorite mustache man, Joseph Joan, was in charge, things were kind of oppressive. They were just really oppressive, actually. It was bad. Where were the Karens when we needed them to stand up to the actual oppression? When Germany was split into cool and not so cool Germany, the division between its citizens was becoming clear. And the people on the capitalist side were just living better. As life is better when you can walk into a German 7-Eleven and purchase a Slim Jim, cigarettes, Mountain Dew, and a reputable magazine with lewd centerfolds. You know the one. So Mustache Man, feeling confident after getting rid of history's favorite mustache man, blocked roads and trains from Berlin in hopes that the West would give in to his demands. And in pure teenage defiance, the West began to fly in supplies daily. 12,000 tons of goods daily. That's a lot of centerfolds, my guy. Number 3, the man who saved the world. Vasily Arkhipov, not a name I reckon my humble bumblebees are familiar with. Well, why is this man so important? He's one of the reasons why you're not watching this video from the comfort of a concrete bunker. During the totally non-controversial Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a Russian submarine with a Russian submarine commander. All Sean Connery jokes aside, the sub had nuclear capabilities. What's even scarier than that is due to some rising tensions and miscommunication, the bane of every good relationship, 3 out of 4 keys had been turned and were waiting on Vasily's response. Those were keys to launch nukes, by the way. Maybe it was his bleeding Russian heart, or his strong will to save mankind. Or it could have been nuclear radiation warping his brain and body due to a previous mishap on the sub. But regardless, he said nay, and the nuclear war was avoided. Thank goodness. I hope that never happens again. Whew. I think it happened again. Number 2, Broken Arrow. What is scarier than the uncertain destruction of society as we know it? And trust me, nuclear fire would be a bad way to go. I don't want to grow another third arm. The first one was difficult to get rid of. Well, how about not knowing at all where the bombs are? Sure, you wouldn't really see one until there was a mushroom cloud over your favorite vegan restaurant, and by then it would just be too late. But what I'm talking about is devices that got lost in the mail or just lost by the military. And yes, it's happened multiple times through the decades. One incident where a device was lost from a crashed plane and 3 out of the 4 safeties had been failed. That's a little too close for comfort. But of the declassified incidents the US is willing to tell you about, the Soviet Union has never said how many they lost. Just one of those comforting facts to keep both sides of your pillow warm at night. Начальник сказал, что нитяк. Number 1, happy ending. There were tons of things to talk about during the Cold War. Seriously, you need a historian and a few textbooks to break everything down. However, when you boil down the main events, what was it really for? All that tension and stress. Nuclear war is just on the horizon. Years of arms racing and flinging people into the atmosphere faster than you can say, look out Ukraine. A lot of things changed and a lot didn't. To me, it just seems like it's such a waste of money and time to have all those world enders collecting dust somewhere under an onion-shaped building. Russia has some onion-shaped buildings. I'm just assuming that's where they are. I'm hungry at this point. The point I'm making is, let's keep the nuking to the Fat Man and Fallout, the video game, not real life. Let's just be peaceful. Number 10, the Pig Wars. If there's one thing Americans love besides Dunkin' Donuts, I mean, I'm just assuming because your commercials tell me that America runs on Dunkin's. If it's not that, it's Manifest Destiny. It seems the second the founding fathers and patriots won their freedom, they wanted just a wee bit more and took over what is now the United States of America from coast to coast. Thing is, Britain was also still there in a land known as Canada, or actually British North America, or Rupert's Land if you went to Canadian history class. The British were doing the same thing and expanding westward. They both got to the Pacific West Coast and everything was cool, kosher, great. Well, except for some islands not too far from the mainland. It was heavily debated on who actually owned these islands. Well, it almost turned into another global war. Both Americans and British were living on the island. When a British-owned pig had gone one step too far and eaten out of an American field, the pig paid the price with his life, causing tensions to escalate to the point where the Navy and high-ranking officers got involved. Ooh, not good. Partially being stoked by an American who to this day, no one knows the method to his madness, but apparently he was looking for a fight regardless. Kind of a weird story. All over a pig. Jeez. Number 9, the Anglo-Zanzibar War. One day a disgruntled nephew got rid of his uncle and took the Zanzibar throne for his own. Classic story when it comes to royals, that's what they do. Naturally, the British who said dibs on Zanzibar were not all too pleased, as they had someone else in mind for the throne. Someone who would let them in and keep empiring as they do. So this angry nephew said, nah, I don't think so, fam. Ain't having that. And he started to organize the troops and in a nutshell said, you know what, why don't you come on in and try and stop me, you and one army. Well, it was the British Army. They did, and it's been recorded as the shortest conflict in human history, lasting only 45 minutes. The nephew escaped to the German embassy and the British moved in. The rest is colonial history. What a great story. Number 8, the Football War. It started with the leaders of Honduras and El Salvador. There was some agriculture and land disputes growing, and the leader of Honduras made it worse by using El Salvador migrants as scapegoats for their problems. Classic dictator move, am I right? Come on. Tensions kept getting hotter to the point where people were being treated differently, and that's not good. And because history is a funny thing, the 1970 World Cup at the time was going to be played by the both feuding nations. The passion, the rage, the anger, the music, they got good music down there, was poured into that game. Well, it was enough for El Salvador to cut all diplomatic ties and after the game, declare war outside of the soccer stadium. For real. People got hurt. It wasn't good. Man, that's rough. Number 7, the Emu War. Say what you will about country folk, but when small town folks band together as one, anything can be accomplished. Well, let's take a trip down under so I can talk about the Emu War. The Great Depression was tough. That was the case for Australian farmers. It was actually a little extra hard for them too. Unfortunately for the farmers, they also had an emu problem. Large birds eating and destroying their crops. I mean, they're massive. You see an emu, they're like this big, they're huge. The government in all her powerful glory decided to step in and lend a hand. They sent out soldiers with trucks and machine blam blams. So obviously the people got rid of the emus, right? It makes sense. There's armies here, we're gonna get rid of them, no problem. Well, no. What should have been an easy work unfolded into the Emu War. Weeks of trying to hunt down the pesky emus. It was somewhat ineffective. One politician joked that emus should be awarded medals for their bravery in standing up to the soldiers. That's just crazy. That's just, wow. Number 6, World War I. While there are many factors that led to World War I, and some that you might not hear in the classroom, but in a nutshell, new technology, militarism, imperialism, and a general distaste for each other were all thrown into a pot. She was turned on high, and when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, she was turned on high, really hot, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. A lot of people will tell you that's where it started, and they're not wrong. However, there was a lot of miscommunication and correspondence that had to happen between the empires first. In a series of very tragic events, leaders were on vacation, didn't get messages, people sat on war declarations, and before peace could be made, people were pointing fingers and playing the blame game, which is pretty much what got boots on the ground. And or to the grounds. Wasn't good. So in a nutshell, World War I was started by miscommunication. That's kind of awkward.
Number 5, Battle of Two Sisters. The third battle that took place on the night of June 11th was the Battle of Two Sisters. This battle, as well as Mount Harriet and Mount Longdon, were brigade-sized operations that all happened, remind you, on the same night. The British were commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Whitehead, and the support consisted of Royal Marines of 45 Commando, the anti-tank troop from 40 Commando, with support from 29 Commando Regiment and naval support from the HMM Glamran. Originally, 45 Commando was to seize Two Sisters Mountain overnight, hiding in the darkness, and if there was enough time, use said darkness to advance onto Tumbledown Mountain. Argentine forces were ready, so the second phase of the attack was unable to happen as they wanted to. In total, 22 British soldiers lost their lives, a destroyer was hit, as well as 3 helicopters, 22 were killed with 47 wounded. Number 4, Friendly Fire. On the 6th of June, 1982, an incident occurred which claimed the lives of 4 British soldiers. Navy destroyer HMS Cardiff destroyed the friendly Gazelle helicopter. So what happened? How does something like this happen in the first place? Well, the HMS Cardiff was on lookout for Argentinian forces. Supplies coming into the Falklands Islands, of course, is a no-go. So on the night of June 5th, HMS Cardiff was stationed east of the islands, and at 2 a.m. they detected the British Gazelle helicopter, thinking that it was an attack. The helicopter was actually making a routine delivery with both equipment and soldiers on board. So what went wrong here? Well, first, after the Sea Dart missile was fired, the next morning it was assumed enemy fire was initially responsible. The Ministry of Defense stated they didn't want to cause further anguish to relatives while they were trying to piece together what went wrong, so it was a lot happening in one night. So some articles made it sound like they tried to hide it. It was really just they had their hands full and it was an accident. A lack of communication between the Army and the Navy was to blame, but not one individual per se, confirms the Board of Inquiry. The 5th Infantry Brigade had not notified anybody of the helicopter's flight, so it was a surprise to many, especially coming in at that speed to that location. The radar also doesn't look good at 2 a.m. when you see that blip coming in. And on top of that, the helicopter's identification friend or foe transmitter, the IFF, it was turned off at this point because it had previously interfered with the Army's anti-aircraft system. So it was just an accident. Number 3, HMS Sheffield. The Type 42 guided missile destroyer was the second Royal Navy ship to be named after the city of Sheffield, Yorkshire. In response to the Argentine invasion, Sheffield was sent to retake the islands on April 2nd, 1982. Captain Salt had ordered the ship to change course every 90 seconds to avoid submarine threat. The 2 weeks prior to the attack, Argentine forces were training against their own ships, which happened to include Type 42 destroyers, the same class as the HMS Sheffield. So they knew the radar detection distances and their reaction times like the back of their hand at this point. They used a technique called pecking the lobes, which meant that they would avoid detection by flying on the side of the emitting radar out of sight. The destroyer was hit on May 4th and foundered while under tow 6 days later on May 10th. Number 2. The Battle of Seal Cove. Just west of Lively Island during the Falklands War, the Battle of Seal Cove was also underway. On May 22, the British frigates HMS Brilliant and HMS Yarmouth were supporting Operation Sutton. This was happening right off of San Carlos Bay, when they received orders to stop and take over an Argentinian coastal supply boat, the ARA Monsunan. It was a 326-ton British coaster that had previously been owned by the Falkland Islands Company, but during the invasions, the ship was captured. It was also loaded with 150 drums of fuel and 250 sacks of flour. The HMS Yarmouth opened fire and forced that vessel to beach on Seal Cove. And finally, coming in at number 1, young soldiers. It's important to remember how young these brave soldiers were at the time. I wanted to finish this list off by sharing the words of a Royal Navy veteran who was only a teenager during the Falklands War. Craig Mac McDermott was 17 at the time. Craig was on the HMS Antrim in 1982 when conflict took off. The actual location of the Falkland Islands is different than most expect. Craig explains his initial thoughts at the time. He shared this in the Daily Record last November. When I first heard of the Falkland Islands, like many people, I thought they were just off the north of Scotland. I didn't know where they were, but there's no way I will ever forget them after everything I've witnessed. We were naive and too young to understand the severity of what we were about to encounter. The air attacks were constant and there were several injured during each of the attacks. The suffering was indescribable and something that I'll never be able to forget. Thank you for your service, Craig.
Number 10, rationing. So I think it's important to begin this list by talking about rationing. Lots of food was sent away to help the soldiers going off to fight in the war. That means that each person only had a certain amount of coupons that they were allowed to use to buy things like eggs, sugar, flour, etc. There were less shipments coming from other companies due to the threat of U-boat attacks. So food became really expensive and people panicked, rushing to stores to stock up. In 1918, the government decided to introduce rationing so as to develop a way to share food fairly. That way grocery stores didn't face a ridiculous shortage of toilet paper. Even the King and Queen of England had ration cards, and the cards could only be used at certain shops. If you were caught stealing or cheating, then you could be fined or even thrown into prison. Fortunately, nobody starved, but people were often left hungrier than usual. To aid with that missing spot in their tummy, people began cultivating their own gardens, and preserved jams, pickles, and chutneys became really popular. Number 9. Vegetarian chopped liver. So with rations and war being introduced, people had to get used to a whole different way of life. If they were craving one of their favorites for dinner, they had to get inventive. Hence, vegetarian chopped liver. It won't surprise you to learn that during World War II, a lot of Jewish families in occupied territories were advised to stretch their food rations very thin, which often meant filling in a recipe with something a lot cheaper. Chopped liver was a staple dish, so to find a way to fill the gap, they created a vegetarian version. They found a way to make it, kind of, using fresh fruits, vegetables, meat was swapped out for green beans, peas, onions, hard-boiled eggs, if possible, and crackers. Number 8. Mock goose. So the war is on, rations are in play, but Christmas is still coming, and hey guys, it's Thanksgiving this weekend too. Happy Thanksgiving, Americans. What on earth was going to take the place of a delicious roast Christmas goose? Well, I introduced to you mock goose. I'm just realizing that World War eras were actually pretty vegetarian friendly, because no one could really afford meat. Mock goose was a combination of sliced potatoes, apples, cheese, sage, vegetable stock, and a teaspoon of flour. They would place a layer of sliced potatoes, then apples, sage, seasoning, cheese, and then repeat. Basically a potato, apple, and cheese lasagna. I'm glad they didn't try to make it look like a goose because it's almost worse eating something that doesn't taste what it looks like, you know? Number 7. War cake. Though the recipe was printed in the Second World War, it also made the rounds in World War I. People weren't going to stop craving delicious tea cakes and sweets just because of the war. If anything, it made them crave it more. But they had to make do with what they had. Recipes like this one often appeared in women's magazines, as food conservation was seen as a way women contributed to the war effort. Canadian war cake goes as follows, and though the ingredients don't seem that odd, the making was a bit strange. It includes 2 cups of sugar, 2 cups of hot water, 3 tablespoons of lard or a fat, 1 teaspoon of salt, cloves, cinnamon, seedless raisins, not a raisin fan. This would then all be boiled together and then cooled. They would boil that together. I've never actually read a recipe like that at all. Then 4 cups of flour would be added and a tablespoon of soda and baking powder. The consistency of the cake was closer to that of a dense spread, but when you've got to take it day by day, it was a small joy. Number 6, the potato pasty. Potatoes! I love potatoes. Easy to grow, versatile, tasty. Potatoes became the go-to saviors of many a recipe. The British government even handed out leaflets encouraging people to get inventive with the potato. There were recipes from the normal baked potatoes, biscuits, and even something called a potato piglet, which was supposed to substitute, somehow, a sausage roll. But then of course there was the potato pasty. It was a pie pastry which contained margarine or a fat was also really hard to come by, flour, potato, and salt. They had to eat it as soon as it was hot, as it had a tendency to dry up once it cooled down. They also used potatoes in general with other recipes to make them more filling.
Number 5, a second helping. Japan had thoroughly whipped Russia's bum in the Russo-Japanese War, proving even though Japan was a small country in the east, it was not to be messed with, flexing power and might of their European counterparts. It was such an embarrassing loss for Russia, some consider it to be a factor in the revolution against the monarchy. When the Russian Civil War broke out, other nations had interest in supporting the White Army, Japan being one of them. Aid was sent to help destroy the Soviets, but Japan sent actual troops to fight. This sounds not so super awesome, and honestly thanks to Japan, that was just the kind of energy going around. However, Japan wasn't 100% sold on the cause, and in reality was most likely looking to grab some more land from eastern Russia. Land which may or may not have been stockpiling resources that may or may not be valuable. Who knows? I don't know. We want them. Number 4, the Green Armies. So as it turns out, the Civil War started by a group who overthrew the monarchy might create some political strife in your country. And if you didn't know, Russia is a big country and it actually has a diverse population made up of many ethnic backgrounds. And during this very bloody conflict, farmers and common folk often got the worst of it. So they formed something called the Green Army. This was something that was opposed to either government trying for power, as their interests were in themselves and did not want a third party interfering with their already poor lives. It makes a lot of sense when you really look into the history. It's safe to say that after history's second favorite mustache man came to power, that some of these folks who rebelled for their own good probably ended up in a gulag. Ooh. Number 3, propaganda. Civil wars do a great job of dividing people. The more disinformation you can spread, the more people you can hopefully persuade to your side. It's just strange in a civil war, however, to spread disinformation about your own people. You may think different things, but you all belong in the same country. Unfortunately, for the Russian Civil War, neither party was exactly the hero. It's just not a case of hero versus villain. As we know that when the Reds won, it became the very uncool or totally just bad, not cool, very mean USSR. And while we can only speculate what would happen if the Whites won, it probably would not have boded well for the Russian people, especially if we were to go off how the government performed in the past. Plus, the foreign intervention would not have gone off without compensation, or something asked for in return. So let's talk smack about each other and see who wins. Sounds good, right? Yeah, sure. Number 2. You look tasty, comrade. Hey. All this chaos was causing havoc on the commoners. People were beginning to get very hungry. Famine had struck the nation due to many factors of the revolution and civil war, including the destruction of rail. Lack of food, ironically, would only further anti-government ideals. In some extreme cases, in the hardest hit areas like the Volga, people had to resort to cannibalism. An estimated 5 million Russians would succumb to the famine, not just from eating each other, but just from not eating food at all. At one point, things were so bad that relief agencies had to give food to railroad staff just to get supplies moving. I went to a meeting with the chief last night, and you know what? He said that ain't it. Number 1, just be nice. This decades-long revolution and short but brutal civil war just possibly, maybe, could have been avoided if Nicholas II had have been a better leader. Instead, he found himself in many controversies and many crises that he really just kind of neglected. I would have to be your history teacher and teach a whole class on the ins and outs of the Russian Revolution and Civil War, but with his lack of leadership, a failing government, and oppression, that leads people to such extremes of communism. The people can only suffer so much before the bald guy with a pointy beard starts to make sense. Number 10, Crying Wolf. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was a conflict between Vietnam and US forces in 1964. What's messed up about that is that 2 days later, it happened again. Actually, it didn't. Big prank. The second incident was fabricated by the US just to justify ramping up their presence in Vietnam. Sadly, it worked, as the next 8 years in Vietnam would end up being a total snipe storm for the US, as they would encounter problems abroad and at home. Thank goodness this is the only time the American government would ever lie about anything ever again, right? This was officially declassified decades later. Number 9. Agent Orange. The world agreed not to use chemical warfare after the First World War, as it was extremely cruel and lethal. So, you might be surprised that America used chemical weapons during the Vietnam War. Agent Orange, brought to you by the Dow Chemical Company, was a herbicide and defoliant dropped and sprayed from air vehicles to cut down the thick jungle brush. Viet Cong soldiers were excellent at living off the land and concealing themselves in the jungle. Bad guy hides in jungle, you remove the jungle. Makes sense. The chemical was extremely effective, but what's so messed up was the negative health side effects. Soldiers that were exposed to the chemical developed cancers years after the war. But what's even more crazy is how it affected the Vietnamese people. It created children with really bad health defects, and to this day there are many people who live with ill side effects of Agent Orange. That's just not right, man. That's wrong. That is so wrong, dude. Number 8. French Indochina. The US was not the first superpower trying to tame Vietnam. Vietnam used to be called French Indochina, and it used to be a colony of France. And when they no longer wanted to be a part of that, France came down to give them a piece of their minds. But you can probably guess how that went, considering the US was there 20 years later trying to do the same thing. While France was trying to keep a colony and the US was trying to stop communism from spreading to other countries, Vietnam was trying to fight for its independence, which is ironic for America because that's how they became a country. And yes, I know that the communist movement in Vietnam wasn't great by any standards, but the regime America was trying to put in place was no better. As much as France would have liked to keep Vietnam, times were changing and there was no victory in sight with or without American support. Number 7. Well, that escalated quickly. Up until 1967, the war was bad. But it was nothing compared to what was going to happen in 1968. In 1968, the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, a massive military campaign designed to destroy the foreign invaders. All across the country, key targets were being attacked, and it seemed overnight that the war went from a 6 all the way to an 11. What's so messed up though is even though the VC did not achieve major victories, it was costing a lot of American lives. With the Viet Cong using the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the war not only escalated in Vietnam, but had reached neighboring nations like Cambodia. This had an effect on the war back home. The US thought and told people it would be a quick war. They had the advantage. But after the VC flexing their military might, it was clear that more US soldiers would be needed to win the war, which some people were beginning to question in the first place. And as time went on, most people would protest America's involvement. Number 6. A terrible loss of life. The Vietnam War is one of the most important events in US history, and honestly world history too. It was a very hot war during the Cold War, which we could do a whole video on that itself. A time of superpowers ready to annihilate one another at the push of a red button. Thousands of young men volunteered or were drafted to fight in a war that would humble the very powerful country. 58,141 Americans would lose their lives in order to contain communism. Of that 61%, they were under the age of 21. That is an insane, I can't even believe that. The Vietnamese lost over 300,000 people in the conflict. The war is remembered for being a tragic loss of life, and the domino theory that communism would spread throughout the world if containment was not initiated didn't happen, as most countries today just aren't communist. Number 5. Mad Jack Churchill. Again, not exactly its own war, but Buddy here was fighting his own war basically. Meet Mad Jack Churchill, a British commando who went into battle with a sword and bagpipes. I'm gonna say that again for the people in the back. Went into a modern war with modern weapons using a sword and bagpipes. When asked about his medieval ways, Jack replied with, "Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." To add to this already insanity that is Mad Jack Churchill, he holds the record, or title, for the last recorded longbow kill in history. That's insane. When in 1940 a poor German soldier met the business end of Jack's barbed arrows, his military career was very impressive, having become a commando and escaping capture from Germans later in the war. He would then marry his wife and stay with her happily ever after for 55 years. Why is there not a movie of that guy yet? There should be a movie of that guy. Number 4, the Football War. Everyone loves football, and next time the World Cup's coming home. Okay, bad impressions aside, this war is over football. Well, sort of. It does have a little to do with land and agricultural disputes between Honduras and El Salvador. The dictator of Honduras at the time began to use El Salvadorians as a scapegoat, which made tensions sour between the two Central American countries. As it turns out, it was time for the 1970 World Cup, and they were facing each other. But after some classic sabotage by both teams, tensions got even worse, as Honduras began to crack down on immigrant farmers from El Salvador. They'd had enough, cut all diplomatic ties, and declared war. Sometimes referred to as the 102nd War since it was so short, but sadly thousands of people died and it didn't really solve anything. But we still got football though, right? Come on, everyone loves football. Number 3, the Falklands War. If you look at the globe and take a look at the very southern tip of South America, then slightly east of that, you won't see very much. And that's because there isn't very much there. However, what is there is a very small island called the Falklands. It was colonized by Britain, France, and Spain in the 1700s, but because it was so far away, it wasn't really a top priority for any of the imperial powers. Everyone kinda had more important stuff going on. Well, fast forward a few hundred years and now Argentina wanted a piece of the action. Thinking taking the islands was going to be a cakewalk, Argentine forces took over. Britain, feeling like Argentina didn't respect the holy playground rule of dibs since they left a plaque on the island stating that it was theirs, went to war. A war which sadly did cost a few hundred lives. Today it's remembered for its losses and the leadership of Iron Lady Margaret Thatcher. Number 2. The enemy of mine enemy is mine friend. This is just too weird not to mention. May of 1945 was just a bad time to be a German evil mustache man. Actually, he was kaput, but the war still raged on. The weirdest battle of the month would have to be the Battle of Castle Itter. High-value French prisoners were being held in a castle that had been transformed into a prison. A small American force approached the castle when the Germans were spotted. The Germans immediately surrendered, and then offered to aid the Americans in liberating the French prisoners. Yep, that's right. Trouble is, there was a German SS force that wasn't going to let that happen. So, it was Americans and Germans versus some naughtier Germans. And after an intense firefight, the joint force would be victorious and the prisoners freed. Number 1, second-rate ostrich.
Any remaining Jedi will be hunted down and defeated. Any collaborators will suffer the same fate.
That was terrible. Anyway, sorry, that's my Palpatine side coming through. Sorry about that, guys. This is gonna be the weirdest thing you're gonna hear all week. Okay, I'm willing to bet most of you folks at home have never heard of the Emu War, which may be because the Aussies don't want you to know about it, as it is a little embarrassing, but basically this is how it went down. The Great Depression sucked for everyone. Australia was hit rather hard as they relied on agriculture exports. People just weren't buying. To make matters worse, there was an abundance of pests destroying crops. The worst of these crop eaters are knockoff ostriches, emus. So many emus are running amok that the farmers asked the military for help. The military, not wanting to mess around, obliged by sending a couple of men with 2 Lewis machine guns. When the pack of bloodthirsty emus was shot at, they ran away, and only a small number were killed. This happened multiple times, so much so that it was jokingly said that the emus should receive medals for their valor. Of an estimated 20,000 emus wreaking havoc, only about 1,000 were terminated. The army also spent a lot of machine gun rounds for this operation, so in a nutshell, the emus kinda won. Yikes.
Number 10. Nakano Takeko. A shrewd tactician and highly skilled warrior, Nakano was inspired from a young age by the stories of the famed Onimusha Tomoe Gozen. Initially working to teach royal women how to use the naginata, a pole weapon that resembles a cross between a sword and a spear, Nakano would be embroiled within the Boshin War. This civil war saw the Tokugawa shogunate clash with imperial forces. Now, siding with the Tokugawa, she armed herself with a white weapon and gathered a group of women to fight alongside her. This group was dubbed the Joshitai, fighting independently from the main army due to discriminatory rules set by the officials. Famously, at a skirmish at Yanagi Bridge, the Joshitai faced down a squad of imperial troops who, when seeing that their enemies were women, were ordered not to shoot. This brilliant idea was followed up by Nakano easily dispatching between 5 and 6 soldiers single-handedly, the rest of the Joshitai dealing massive damage to the force. Number 9. Lady True. In 226, when Sun Quan sent soldiers to take control of the Jiaoji region, he couldn't have possibly predicted what he'd end up running into. Organizing a rebellion, Lady True gathered 1,000 followers with the goal of revolution. When her brother attempted to prevent her from doing this, Lady True said the coolest thing I've ever heard from a human being. "I'd like to ride storms, kill orcas in the open sea, drive out the aggressors, conquer the country, undo the ties of serfdom, and never bend my back to be the concubine of whatever man." What happened from there isn't terribly well recorded, but it was stated that she fought from the back of a white elephant and may have also been 9 feet tall. That might be fictitious, but regardless, her name has become synonymous as a symbol of rebellion in Vietnam. Number 8. Queen Tuta. Bluntly, it's hard to find good accounts of Tuta's time as a queen, as both of the historians of the time were a little rude. Nevertheless, Queen Tuta rose to power after the death of Angron, becoming the Queen of Illyria. Securing her territory from rebellion, her army also happened to capture a Greek city on their return. Alongside this, Illyria was known for practicing piracy, which strained Greek and Roman trade. Ambassadors were sent to Illyria to negotiate with Tuta, who claimed that stopping the piracy would counter many long-held Illyrian beliefs. Now, one ambassador lost his temper, insulting Tuta to the point where she had them killed. Rome had its reason, and Illyria went to war. Unfortunately, the war was lost due to her forces being spread thin and the betrayal of a local governor. Number 7. Cynone. Born the half-sister of Alexander the Great, Cynone was a warrior princess who commanded the Macedonian armies with a skill second to none. She was recorded defeating an Illyrian queen and army, as well as the remnants of her half-brother's forces led by Alcitas. What little there is that is known of her reign, it is known that she plotted to marry her daughter to Philip Arrhidaeus, surrendering herself to Alcetus in order to delay the oncoming troops while her daughter was wed. Alcetus executed her, but she was so respected by his troops, who had the ones who, had been her enemy, that they rioted against their commander, which fulfilled Cynone's final wishes. Her daughter, Eurydice, would become another famed warrior queen and be buried next to her mother. Number 6. Grace O'Malley. Born to the O'Malley clan in the 1500s, Grace O'Malley earned a fearsome reputation as the pirate queen. Head of the O'Malley clan, she began life as an extremely headstrong woman, one tale of her youth being that she was refused from one of her father's expeditions to Spain due to her long hair potentially getting caught in the ropes, to which she just responded by cutting off all her hair. She defeated clans Joyce and McMahon and became a menace to England, famed for meeting Queen Elizabeth I to negotiate the release of her captured sons. The tales of these negotiations are widespread and also really sick, like how she was caught in the palace with a dagger on her person, or how she was given a lace tissue to sneeze into, which she did and then promptly tossed into a fireplace. In the end, she won her sons back and was given control of her land, employed as one of the world's first privateers under the crown.
Number 5. World War II. Well, surely after the most destructive conflict in human history, we wouldn't be so keen on another, right? Well, wrong. That could be the point right there, but the unusual event that started World War II was nothing. Just like that episode of Seinfeld. It was a war about nothing, George. I don't know. Well, not true, but let me explain. The factors leading up to World War II were all there. Fascism, communism, imperial expansion, again, revenge, unification. However, honestly, like a bunch of bad parents letting their kids get away with anything, nobody really did anything to stop Mustache Man. They used a policy called appeasement, which basically meant he wants something, he gets it. He wants something, he gets it. Not a great system. Okay, you can have that country, but no more. That's it. We appeased you enough. Oh, okay, you can have that one, but next time no more. That's it, for real. Oh, fine, you can have that one too, but now I'm putting my foot down. And after 4 or 5 countries fell to Mustache Man, that's when they finally did something. So really, it was neglect. Number 4, Jenkins' Ear. 1731, Britain. They were looking for an excuse to attack Spain. After all, they've got a lot of loot and gold, and come on, that belongs to Britain. It's gotta go in our museum, come on, that makes sense. They had just about run out of hope until Jenkins walked into the room. Sounds like a joke, but it's true. Jenkins was an English sailor who had gotten into a confrontation with Spanish authorities 8 years prior. Sadly for Jenkins, it cost him his ear. They took off his ear, because that's what you do back then. And as soon as the British caught wind of his ear, well, it was on. So yes, they did start a war over a man's missing ear, because it's a good reason to steal gold. Number 3, the War of the Bucket. Modena and Bologna, 2 warring Italian city-states. One sponsored by the big man in the big hat, which is the Pope as they call him I think, and the other was the Holy Roman Emperor. Big power struggle. Who's in charge? I don't know. This was kind of the way it went in ye olde medieval Europe. However, in 1325 it began to get a little spicy, as both Modena and Bologna would make a day out of raiding each other's cities, because even though we're pretty similar, we'll just attack each other, because yeah, sure. However, it got real serious when Bologna's bucket went missing. Oh! It started a war, and the real ironic thing is it might not have been stolen at all and just blamed in confusion of a missing bucket. Modena steals a bucket, we gotta get him. How dare you take my bucket? It's kinda like when your sibling takes your favorite toy. You did what to my action figure? You know what I mean? Number 2, the console war. My generation probably remembers the PS3 versus Xbox 360 war. I'm pretty sure Chris remembers that, he does. See? But the real one was Sega versus Nintendo in the 90s. Well, how did it start? Okay, well, Nintendo was on a huge roll. Super Mario, Metroid, Zelda, you couldn't stop them. That wasn't until the Sega Genesis released with the edgiest blue hedgehog ever to grace your old TVs. Millions of dollars in smear campaigns, Genesis does what Nintendo doesn't. I'm sure you guys all remember that commercial. It was a really powerful commercial. I learned about it in business class, so there you go, look at that. And number 1, the Russo-Japanese War. This one's crazy. How about a war, cause it'll make us look cool, said the advisors to Tsar Nicholas II, worried the Russian Empire didn't look so cool anymore because it's been failing for a while. And in a classic schoolyard tactic, let's find the weakest link and start there. Well, they thought it was Japan, but as it turns out, Japan wasn't that guy, pal. He's not that guy, pal. And they won, very surprising literally everyone. So not only did a massive European power start a conflict with a puny island nation for bragging rights, but they also lost that war to a puny island nation for bragging rights. That's just crazy. Number 10, the Jaguar Warrior. Mesoamerica, a beautiful ancient place full of culture, wonder, and civilization. If you're a Spanish conquistador, then the most important thing there is riches, gold. There's lots of gold there. Tons and tons of riches. However, something some folks may not know about is a very powerful warrior the Aztecs had, the Jaguar Warrior. RAR XD. Don't ever do that again, sorry. that's just the worst. Yes, and just as vicious as it sounds, the Aztecs had no standing army, so most men were kind of just trained to be warriors just in case. The Jaguar Warrior was a fierce warrior who proved his salt by capturing 4 enemies. And only then he would be classified as such. Now, why is capturing enemies so important, you may ask? Well, it's so you have a plentitude of sacrifices to make when the gods ask you for some. Oh yes, they do this in full dress too, sometimes even wearing a jaguar skin on their head and their backs. It's kind of weird. Just keep your eyes out for those ones, folks. Keep your eyes out in the jungle, you never know. Number 9, Spartan. Did you really think I wasn't going to mention Spartans when talking about the most powerful warriors in history? Sparta, another beautiful ancient place full of culture and wonder. Sadly, these were times of great battles, and none were better than the Spartans at this. Complete with their Agog training, Spartans were bred for this kind of butter. Working as a unit with a group of Phalanx strategy made them extremely effective. Complete with their shield spear and short Zepho sword, the Spartans were a formidable fighting force, and the bravest of warriors. You only have to look at the examples like the Battle of Thermopylae to have this make sense, and the movie 300. I love those painted on abs, you gotta love them, right? Number 8, Samurai. Anime fans rejoice, because I have now mentioned samurai, all is well. Where would we be without the samurai and his katana? I don't know honestly, but they are warriors not to be trifled with, I do know that. The samurai were a unique class of warrior, and in the beginning they were paid to protect the goods of those who could not afford such services. But eventually they became so wealthy that they became a noble class of their own, and their boss sort of became the leader of a fractured nation. The emperors are still there, but the shoguns, they're the ones in charge. Kinda like your mom and dad at home. Yeah, dad's there, he shows up, but Mom runs the show, we know how it goes. They followed a code of honor and did whatever to uphold that. Cunning warriors and excellent swordsmanship, as well as archers and horse riders. They were so cool that it gave George Lucas an idea back in the 1970s to base the Jedi around them. If that's not cool, I don't know what is. The samurai ruled for hundreds of years, with their share of victories and defeats. Number 7. Ninja. The warrior that goes bump in the night. The reason why dudes with my proportion thinks warriors in black cloaks running on rooftops with frog-toed shoes are cool. I know, nice. The ninja, stealth and espionage expert, and maybe the first to do so. The ninja were a group of mercenaries in the 15th century Japan, or at least got their start in 15th century Japan, who rose to prominence as the guys you hire when you need some shady stuff done. The battles between samurai and ninja are noteworthy to say the least. However, the fact that more often than not, instead of fighting the samurai often hired the ninjas to do their dirty work. Corruption, theft, sabotage, and just some good old-fashioned spying. Good old stuff. This sneaking around was accompanied by some excellent fighting tactics and dastardly weaponry to go along with it. The black egg in particular gives me nightmares. It's kind of like when you got something stuck in your eye and you just can't get it out, except it's not an eyelash. It's a little egg that you throw at people's faces and it's filled with crushed glass. Ouch. I don't even know how you'd get that out in ancient times. There's no eye wash station, so you know what? Cut it. I ain't part of that one. Ain't doing it. Nope.
Number 5. National flower. While flour was sometimes permitted, flour wasn't encouraged and was one time banned for household use. It was still being allowed commercially for like other cakes and biscuits and stuff. But they had to supply a replacement, so wartime specific products were launched. One was called the National Flour, wheat meal essentially. It was gray in color and had a lot of bran in it. It wasn't as smooth or as soft as flour, so women would desperately like sieve it through their stockings to kind of get like a nice like desired soft texture. Didn't always work. They also used this as a way to feed their chickens without having to spend money on rations. This flour was the key ingredient as to what would be called the national loaf. Nutritionists, funny enough, loved it for some reason because it was like really high in fiber and tried to fight for the bread to be popular post-war. But unfortunately, it wasn't very tasty. It sucked. It was often referred to as Hitler's secret weapon because everyone hated it so much. On the upside though, the government was able to keep the supply plentiful enough, so bread was never rationed. Number 4. Spam. Oh, spam. The canned meat people still seem to love. The British tradition for mealtime was to have at least 1 meat and 2 veg. You can guess what stood in for the meat. Spam. The government tried to introduce the Brits to corned beef, an insult. So then they tried something called snoek, which was like a snake mackerel from South Africa. People didn't even like to talk about that one. But then spam came over from the US. It was filling and tasty, just enough to fill that little spot in their tummy. Although it couldn't replace a good steak, it had a long shelf life, and it was perfect for troops in the trenches. Number 3. Pig and chicken clubs. One of the things I love about England or the UK in general is that everyone, even in suburban neighborhoods, have chickens in their backyard. Okay, maybe not everyone, but it's really popular and it's kind of normal. My aunt has always kept them in her backyard since as far back as I can remember. But it wasn't always like that. In the 1940s, commercially farmed hens had to be sold off as food because they didn't have enough to feed them. This led to a massive egg shortage. Only 1 egg was allowed per person per week. Unless you were expecting mother, you were allowed 2. But as a result, people who hadn't kept chickens before this started to in their backyards. You had to give up your egg ration, but got to have more grain rations instead. The same thing happened with pigs. Neighborhoods would keep pigs, feed them together, and then share in them. Some would even keep their pigs private, but they had to be registered so you could give up your meat coupons, but some never did. So it was a little bit cheeky. Number 2. Roosevelt coffee. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, some days I really couldn't do this job without coffee. Like I really couldn't. It's a problem. And I'm sure many people feel the same, but sadly for them, back then, coffee was rationed. Pretty much every ounce of coffee was shipped overseas, making coffee impossible to come by in the States. Americans were tasked with drinking less than 1 cup a day. That's like compared to everyone else's 4 cups a day. Introducing Roosevelt coffee. People started making it to help fill in the gap. It was simply reused coffee grounds mixed with ingredients like chicory and postum. It made a kind of watery version of a cup of joe. The chicory added a little spice to it, while postum, a molasses-like substance, added color and flavor, I guess? It wasn't a good time. But last but not least, Hershey's chocolate. The men who took up arms in the trenches faced some of the worst horrors ever imagined. To them, any day, any moment could be their last. A pretty bleak world to live in and day out. Morale was crucial to maintain, as it could mean the difference between life and death for many soldiers. One way to help support them was food. On June 6, 1944, the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy during the D-Day invasion. But what you may not know is that an unlikely treat fueled them throughout the mission: Hershey's chocolate bars. Hershey's was approached by the US Army in 1937, way long before the war started, about creating a bar for emergency rations. They had to weigh 4 ounces, be high in energy, withstand high temperatures, and taste a little better than a boiled potato. They didn't want it to be too tasty, otherwise they'd run out. It was called the D ration bar, a blend of chocolate, sugar, cocoa butter, skim milk, and oat flour. And it ended up not tasting too great, but it gave the Allies enough oomph to seize the day.
Number 10. The war to end all wars. Alright, hear me out. Everyone knows about World War I, but that doesn't mean it wasn't weird. World War I was probably one of the weirdest wars to ever be fought, technologically speaking. To put this into perspective, the first successful flight of airplanes was by the Wright brothers. It had only been done 5 years prior. World War I is also noted for the first use of tanks, chemical weapons, just to name a few party favors. But perhaps the weirdest thing about World War I was the use of old war tactics against new war tech. It was quickly discovered that running directly into machine gun fire is bad for your health. Number 9. Just say no! Honestly, just a classic move. Great Britain, being broke, needed a new revenue stream. In total Pablo Escobar style, the British forced their way into China, where they fought a war, and China was forced to cede over Hong Kong and other ports, along with letting Britain come in there and just sell all this delicious opium. It's weird because this is a similar tactic to what you'd see with cartels and gangsters, not a country. If old Ronald Reagan knew what was really happening during the opium wars, he'd be rolling around in his grave. Just say no, kids. Number 8. The Pig Wars. This is so weird it could only be real. So here's the rundown. After America had beaten Britain in the Revolutionary War, it was time for Manifest Destiny, expanding westward. The British were doing the same thing. They got to the Pacific West Coast and everything was cool, except for some islands not too far from the mainland. It was heavily debated on who owned these islands. Surely this can be resolved without conflict. Yes, it can be, and don't call me Shirley. Well, it almost turned into another global war, actually. Both Americans and British were living on the island, and when a British-owned pig had gone one step too far and eaten out of an American field, that pig paid the price with his life, causing tensions to escalate to the point where the Navy and high-ranking officers got involved. Partially being stoked by an American who, to this day, no one knows the method to his madness, but was honestly just looking for a fight regardless. What a crazy guy. Shot a pig, we're gonna start a war. Number 7. The Anglo-Zanzibar War. Never heard of this one, I bet. And as a comedian, I can appreciate the comedic value of this war. Not that wars are funny, but trust me, you'll see. The Anglo-Zanzibar War was a military conflict fought between the United Kingdom and the Zanzibar Sultanate on the 27th of August, 1896. Good year. What's very unusual about this war is its length. No, not because it's still happening today in a technicality like the Korean War, but rather how quick it ended. The conflict lasted about 40-45 minutes. The British Navy began a cannonade at 9 AM and had destroyed a large amount of the Zanzibar force by 9:45, leaving only one British sailor injured. The leader of Zanzibar made his escape, and the British officially moved in. Brutally moved in as well, actually. It was an occupation, it wasn't good. Number 6. For the Emperor. This one is my personal favorite on the list, as it's a story too crazy to believe, but it is very true. Strap in for this one, folks. What do you call it when the war you were fighting ended 25 years ago, but the enemy still thinks it's on? Yep, that's right. If you don't know, this actually happened, and while not a new war per se, it is technically their own little war. What I'm referring to is the Japanese holdouts of the Second World War. In the Pacific theater of war, Americans adopted a strategy called island hopping, which basically saw Marines clear out dug-in Japanese forces all throughout the many islands of the Pacific. When one was cleared out, they would move on to the next, and so forth and so forth. Except the thick jungles of these islands are good at hiding things, more specifically hiding Japanese soldiers who continued to fight World War II even though it was over years prior. Every few years or so, more soldiers would come out of hiding and surrender, but the most extreme case being Hiro Onada, who was fighting the war for almost 30 years. from 1944 to 1974. During his time hiding, he raided and unalived local Filipino farmers. Next time you go to the jungle, just be careful. You don't know who's out there. Always watching, Mike Wazowski. I'm always watching.
In 5th place, we have an airman who crashed and survived. Nicholas Alcamaide was born in 1922 in Norfolk, England, and was a gardener before signing up with the Royal Air Force when the Second World War broke out. He was part of a crew that flew an Avro Lancaster Mk2, which often flew night missions, and as such was christened Werewolf. Kinda funny. Nicholas flew 14 successful missions with the crew of Werewolf, and on the night of March 24th of 1944, they were part of a raid targeting Berlin. They managed to successfully deliver their payload, but on the return journey, heavy winds took them off course. They wound up flying over the Ruhr region, which had a high concentration of anti-aircraft defenses. Werewolf was attacked from below by a German night fighter aircraft, and the resulting damage tore up Werewolf's wing and fuselage, setting the plane on fire. It's kind of obvious that the Werewolf was beyond salvation, and the pilot ordered the crew to get the heck out. Now Nicholas, alone in his turret at the very back of the plane, was already being scorched by the flames, with his rubber oxygen mask beginning to melt to his face, and his arms were completely seared by the fire, so he was scrambling for his parachute pack and discovered that it was already on fire. Nicholas was now facing a fun dilemma. Either burn to death, or take his chances and jump without a parachute. Well, he jumped from the burning plane, lost consciousness, and miraculously woke up 3 hours later, lying deep in the snow in a pine forest. It seems that the flexible pine trees had slowed his descent enough that the snow was able to cushion his fall. He had not broken any bones, but had managed to sprain his knee after, his 18,000-foot fall from the sky. In addition, he suffered burn wounds from the fire and had pieces of perspex from his flak-shattered screen embedded in his skin. That's a dang miracle if I've ever seen one. He began blowing his distress whistle, which eventually attracted the attention of some German civilians. Nicholas was taken to a nearby hospital where his wounds were treated, and when he was well enough to talk, he was interrogated by the Gestapo. Even after they proved his story was true, and he wasn't a spy, he was sent to the notorious prison camp Stalag Luft III. Nicholas's luck remained with him though. When the camp's 10,000 inmates were forced to trek hundreds of miles across northern Germany through a blizzard with temperatures dropping as low as -22, he survived and was eventually liberated. As my grandpa would say, he was born with a horseshoe up his... Come on, can't I at least say that word? No? Alrighty, up to you folks to finish that sentence. In 4th place, we have explosive devices that are still being found. For context, between 1940 and 1945, US and British Air Forces dropped 2.7 million tons of kabooms on Europe and half that amount on Germany. Under Allied occupation in 1945, reconstruction of what had been destroyed began almost immediately. Yet as many as 10% of the explosives dropped by Allied aircrafts had failed to explode, and as East and West Germany rose from the ruins, thousands of tons of unexploded airborne ordnance lay beneath them. In both the East and the West, responsibility for defusing these devices, along with removing the innumerable hand grenades, bullets, and mortar and artillery shells left behind at the end of the war, fell to specialty police technicians and firefighters known as the KMBD. Y'all don't want to know how many times I tried to say the long form and just, with my brain, it not happening. Sorry. More than 2,000 tons of unexploded munitions are uncovered on German soil every year. Before any construction project begins in Germany, from simply the extension of a home to track laying by the National Railroad Authority, the ground must be certified as cleared of unexploded ordnance. Oh, someone out there finds this far-fetched. Okay. In November of 2013, 20,000 people in Dortmund were evacuated while experts defused a 4,000-pound blockbuster device that could destroy, most of a city block. Specialists discover more than 500 tons of unexploded munitions every year and defuse an aerial device every 2 weeks or so. Did that make your doubts go away? Had a feeling it might. In 3rd place, we have the Museum of a Forgotten Race. After winning the war and achieving their overarching goal of wiping out the Jewish people in Europe, the Nazis originally intended to open a museum that would commit a second genocide and depict the Jews as a people who had to be exterminated because they were a decadent and parasitical race. Which is allegedly why the Nazis were holding on to a centuries-old collection of Jewish artifacts in Prague. Over 85 Jewish people had their lives ended at the Natzweiler Struthof concentration camp in France to serve as part of an initiative of Nazi anthropologists and doctors to dissect and display their bodies in a museum collection dedicated to the supposed inferiority of the eventual extinct race of Jewish people. Modern anthropologists have discovered collections of limbs stored with the intention of being displayed and cataloged. Thank goodness this never came to fruition. In second place, we have some uses for hair and human ashes. It's no secret what went on at concentration camps, with tales of the gas chambers being way too many. Something that doesn't get touched on as much was that when the gas cleared, groups of inmates would shift the corpses, pull out any gold teeth, and shave hair. These men, known as Sonderkommando, were better fed and worked at their grisly tasks for 3 to 4 months before meeting their own end, since they knew too much. The hair was stored in a room above furnaces to keep it warm in the piercing cold of any Polish winter. No such luxury was permitted for the camp's inhabitants, but the hair was worth something, around half a mark a kilo. The textile industry used human hair to line socks and gloves for submarine and railway workers and make thermal blankets. I guess there's kind of like a grim efficiency about it. The human ash from furnaces was stored in 4 purpose-built pits, which remain today, from where it was taken to be spread on local farmers' fields to help with the crops. In first place, we have the experiments of Dr. Joseph Mengele. Also known as the Angel of Death, Dr. Joseph was an anthropologist and SS physician who conducted numerous inhumane medical experiments on the prisoners in Auschwitz. He was particularly interested in twins, as twin research was seen at the time to be the ideal way to determine how the environment or human heredity could influence the human body. He would attempt red fluid transfusions from one twin to another, do amputations to try and sew it on the other twin, stitch 2 twins together to form Siamese twins, infect 1 twin with any kind of disease, and too many other experiments. To the surprise of no one, more often than not, the twins died during the procedures, or he would have them killed afterwards just so he could do an autopsy. If one twin died from disease, he would often end the life of the other as well, to, study the differences between these sick and healthy subjects. The evil doctor was also very interested in heterochromia, where people have irises of different colors, and he would collect eyes and body parts of his victims and send it through for research? He would inject chemicals in victims' eyes to attempt to change their eye color. He also experimented on pregnant women before sending them off to the gas chambers and caused incestuous pregnancies, always under the guise of, research. Oh, and operating on victims without anesthesia. Oh, and if that wasn't, disgusting enough, he tried to prove that Jewish and Romani people were genetically inferior through his morbid experimentation. And now that my stomach is turning, that's the end of our scary stories for today. If you made it this far, congratulations! I'm sure I'll be reliving parts of this in my nightmares tonight.